Hello and welcome to the Pod People, the show where we cast hexes on your hearts and minds. I'm one bad son of a witch, Matisse Van Rossum.
Witch! I'm Ben Sheets.
Ben Sheets. And this week we are talking Suspiria, old versus new. Which one is the better witch movie?
Which one is the
which
real
witch
witch?
is which, bitch? That's the question that we're here to answer today on the Pod People.
Yeah. Well, thankfully we saw both of these movies in theaters.
Yeah, which was actually pretty dope. They just happened to be playing a restored 35 millimeter print of the original at the Carolina Theater, and we got to go see that. So that was pretty cool to be able to see both of the movies on the big screen.
Yeah, and I mean we both have a lot of feelings about both of these movies.
Yes.
But I think regardless, the best way to see both of these was on the big screen.
I think it's the best way to compare them.
Definitely.
Especially considering that, like, the original came out in 1977, so obviously neither of us have ever seen it on the big screen before.
Well, yeah, definitely. And the original, it's such a spectacle that it almost demands a big screen in a way.
Yeah, I think I can agree with that. I guess we're just going to jump right in and
Yeah,
we'll talk about the original by legendary Italian giallo filmmaker Dario Argento. Came out in 1977, like I said before, and is generally considered to be like one of the greatest classic horror films of all time by most people.
Definitely a cult classic. It has a very devoted fan base. It's kind of niche.
Yeah, I think if you were to talk to any like fan of classic horror films, like a true horror fan, that Suspiria is probably in their top 10 of all time for most people. This was my second time seeing it.
I believe this was my third time seeing it.
And yeah, I'm in the small camp of people who does not really like the original Suspiria. I think it's pretty overrated.
Yeah, well, I can understand that opinion 100% because I think if you're going into this movie looking for a strong plot, you're not going to have a good time. But I think the movie works on a different level than that. And that's why it's so effective for me.
Well, since you're the one who likes this movie of the two of us, I'll sort of let you expand on that and how you think it works and on what levels, and then I'll provide my thoughts after that.
Okay, sure, yeah. So I've been thinking about the best way to phrase this, and I think comparing it to a work of music does it a lot of good, and you have to consider in the same way for music, you can argue, what makes music good? Is it lyrics? Is it writing? Is it being in key? Or is it making you feel something, And I think at its core, music is about making you feel something regardless of the tools it uses or even how effective some of the things it does are. And you can use alternative modes of, expression to do that. It doesn't have to be all based on the technicality or the lyricism of a music for it to make you feel something.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%.
You can have a lot of atmosphere built, and you even look at things like drone or ambient where it's non-melodic, but it can make you feel something. And I think in that same respect, you can look at films in the same way. You have to kind of think about what the core concept of a film is trying to do. This is where it kind of gets into a philosophical argument a little bit, because I guess you could argue they're to tell stories, but I would argue it's more primal than that. It's to make you feel something. And I think the story in Suspiria, it's very, very simplistic, very inspired by fairy tales, by expressionism, John Cocteau, German expressionism in a lot of ways. And it tells a very simple childlike story, but the techniques that are used to do it, whether it's the very expressionistic use of Technicolor, whether it's these sweeping camera movements, the excellent score by Goblin. Theme song absolutely slaps.
Oh yeah, it's been stuck in my head for days.
Or even just the sense of unease you get by the off-kilter combination of elements in the movie. It builds this feeling of unease and very surreal sense of something wrong that I don't see in many other movies. And I was in a similar camp to you the first time I saw this movie because I was paying a lot of attention to the story. And the story here, it's paper thin, it's very childish, but on repeat viewings, knowing the story, it allowed me to pay less attention to that and focus instead on the techniques used and the spectacle and the way it made me feel.
Yeah, sure. I'm definitely in the opposite camp of you on this movie. I think I actually liked it less this time than the first time I saw it. I think part of the reason that is because the first time I saw it was when I was in film school, and I think that I sort of sycophantically talked myself into liking it because it was considered such a classic, and I didn't want to be like the one person who didn't like Suspiria, so I did all of this shit to convince myself that it was better than it actually is.
You didn't want to be the one contrarian.
I didn't want to be the contrarian.
It's funny because when I saw it in film school, it wasn't the first time I'd seen it, but when I saw it in film school, I was the exact opposite. I was that contrarian.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're pretty good at being a contrarian in general. And I just, at that time, I did not want to be that dude, but now I don't really give a shit, and I'm not surrounded by a bunch of other film students and stuff, so in this case, seeing it on the big screen, and you know what? Now that I think about it, last time I saw it was actually on the big screen at this fucking student union.
Oh, yeah.
So I've actually seen Suspiria on the big screen twice. But this time, I don't know, I looked at it with a more critical eye. And for me, it's just I totally get the whole mood piece thing, but I think that this movie rides a line that where it needs to go to one side or the other. It either needs to go much more simplistic or rather minimalistic with its narrative, I would say to the point of having almost no dialogue, or it really needs to tighten up the narrative and make it much less sloppy. It's somewhere in the middle. I can understand the comparison to music because the Goblin score is one of the strongest things, if not the strongest things about the original Suspiria. So in a lot of ways, it kind of feels like an 80-minute music video for that one song over and over again. So in that sense, I think that the visuals do a really nice job of accompanying the music, and I think those are the strongest segments of the movie when it is just music and visuals. But my problem just lies so heavily with how sloppy the narrative is and how underdeveloped a lot of the characters are, and sort of I think there's sort of a general lack of motivation in a lot of the characters, and especially in the villains. It's something that I have a really hard time getting past because I want to like it. I think the central concept is really interesting. This American girl travels to a dance academy in Berlin, and it turns out that the academy is run by a coven of witches who are killing people for reasons. And that's one of my problems with the movie, is that they are just killing for reasons. There's not really much rhyme to what they're doing. Right, much rhyme or reason, I guess. And that just feels like so underdeveloped, and it makes me, feel like, why am I really supposed to care about what's happening?
Well, first off, I will say I'm in total agreement with you on the soundtrack. Like, it totally elevates it when it's used, and a lot of times it's used incredibly effectively. I think of like the first airport scene where we're cutting between seeing Jessica Harper go towards the exit door, and then we get POV shots where every time we get the POV shot, it's blasting the Goblin soundtrack.
Right.
And it gives the sense of, turn back now. Things are gonna go
right
very
as she's
wrong.
moving closer to the door. Yeah. And that stuff, I think, is how you do visual storytelling well. And for its time, this movie was like hyper stylized. Like, I don't think there's like a single white light bulb in the entire goddamn movie. It's all neon, and the set design is very fantasy influenced and fairy tale influenced. So, like, all of the aesthetic of the original Suspiria is excellent. That's something that I'll give it. The combination of the cinematography, the camera work, the art design, the set design, the costumes, the music, like, it all has such a strong, like, powerful aesthetic, and that's what lets me down about it, is because the story doesn't stand up to that aesthetic that it sets.
When you were saying that, you mentioned fairy tale, which I think is a very apt comparison in a lot of ways.
Sure.
The story is very childlike, and it's based on folklore. The idea of, a coven of witches,
right,
in a dance academy. That was a tall tale that was passed down the line generations. So I think that's kind of why the story didn't bother me as much, because I feel like most fairy tales don't have like super in-depth, character.
No, I agree.
Motivation.
And I don't have a problem with simplicity, but I think that they could have still made the story a little bit stronger. I think a lot of that would have been carried by better characters, and in several cases, better actors. Like, some of the acting is just downright bad. Jessica Harper is pretty good. They actually saw her in Phantom of the Paradise, and that's why they wanted to get her for this movie. She was Phoenix in that. I think the lady who plays Mrs. Tanner is pretty good. But other than that, like, I think the acting is pretty weak.
Well, and it kind of gets elevated too, because it is an Argento film, and in Americanized Argento film, where he was focusing on making English dubs,
right,
for all of his movies at the time. And so you have Jessica Harper, who's an American actress, and she's basically not dubbed.
Right.
But you have other characters that are just awfully dubbed.
Right.
And the performances take a hit because of it, I think, sometimes, because there's some lost in translation.
Well, I mean, Italian cinema was really late on getting on in the camp of recording live audio. A lot of that came out of necessity after World War II, and everybody was really fucking broke, so they couldn't really afford to record sound on set. But then it sort of became a stylistic thing, especially for the giallo subgenre of Italian horror. So most of Argento's films from these, from this era are dubbed. And like, what that does is it leaves open a lot of really cool sound design, like having to build the sound effects, and I think that a lot of that is done really well. Some of the dialogue can definitely be off-putting at first. Like, I've seen enough giallo and enough Argento that dubbing doesn't bother me terribly, but the bad performances do.
The bad dubbing in this movie was pretty egregious at times,
yeah,
which is always surprising to me, because I think the sound design in this movie is pretty incredible, and the mixing is really good, but it's just that dubbing just throws me off. And I mean, I guess you could argue, it makes the movie seem off, but not in a good way.
No, I
not
can,
in an intentional way. I feel like everything else. In this movie.
I can agree with that, but the dubbing was one of the things that bothered me least about the movie, I guess. I feel like I should also qualify that, like, in general, I am a big fan of Dario Argento. Like, to say that I like this movie or I dislike this movie is not because I dislike him. And in fact, I think part of the reason I do dislike it is because all of the other films of his that I've seen, I thought were really good. They impressed me a lot. And so the fact that this film has such like an elevated status in his filmography and stuff like Opera or Deep Red or Tenebrae don't.
I mean, they still do.
I mean, kind of. Deep Red, yeah, but like when most people think of Argento, they think of Suspiria. And I just don't think it deserves that. I think that he is such a better filmmaker than this movie would lead you to believe. I mean, granted, I know he's still alive. I think he is. I haven't seen any of his recent output in the last 2 or 3 decades, but
well, I saw The Bird with the Crystal Plumage.
That was his first one, wasn't it?
A couple months ago. Yeah, it was playing at the Carolina as well, and I wasn't really impressed.
I haven't seen
it. It was
that
kind
one.
of boring. It wasn't very stylized. It was okay, but it was just kind of boring, honestly. But I think the strength of this movie lies in its visual storytelling more than its literal storytelling, through the camera work, through sequences like the airport sequence, or the sequence where the woman falls through the glass pane and her heart gets stabbed.
Some of the effects are really good, and there's a lot of good practicals and gore and stuff.
Yeah, and I would even argue that the story is the set pieces.
Yeah, I can agree with that to an extent, but then that goes back to what I was saying earlier, where if that's really the route they wanted to take, I think they should have gone even more minimal and done much less or no dialogue. Because I think what Argento does really well in his other movies is they are less stylized in terms of camera work. They're always pretty stylized, but he did a lot of like slasher films that are sort of like investigation kind of stories, like figuring out who is the killer, murder mystery kind of things like that. Whereas in this one, that's not really the case. Like, it's a coven of witches doing black magic and killing people. So it's dealing with the supernatural, which is something that he didn't do a ton prior. And there's still like an attempt to make this like an investigation story at times. And I think that that's so underdeveloped in this movie and so weak that it's really hard to care about. So I think if they did really want to make it a visual storytelling mood piece, then it should have been much more minimalistic. I think he was trying to do too much of what he did in other films, and the clashing of styles doesn't work for me.
Yeah, I just never felt like the murder mystery was that much on the forefront. It's in there, but I feel like it's almost just used as a secondary vehicle to get to one from one set piece to the next. And you even get more visual storytelling sequences like Sarah and Susie counting the footsteps, which I think works pretty well, honestly. I think, Susie discovering the iris in the room and turning it works
that
pretty
opens
well.
The secret corridor. Yeah.
I think the final sequence when she's first discovering the witches, I mean, the Marco stuff at the very end can be its own conversation.
Yeah.
But I think the sequence when she's walking down the hallway and slowly discovering what's going on is pretty effective.
I mean, I guess, but I don't feel like she's really discovering that much. Like, when she finally comes upon the coven, all she hears is them saying, "Kill the American bitch," but there's no reason for that. Like, why do they hate her so much? Like, what has she done to draw their ire so fiercely?
Well, that's
and
the
it's
thing.
like, it's not much of a revelation. Like, she's the protagonist. We already know she's in danger, and hearing it out of the villains' mouths that she's in danger doesn't do a whole lot to advance anything, I don't think.
But I mean, I think the thing is, and we even get this from the very beginning with the airport sequence when, you know, we get the music, when we get her point of view. Argento wants to bring us into her perspective and
Sure.
see the events of the movie through her eyes in a lot of ways in this movie. And I think it works for me because at that point in the movie, you know, it's right near the very end, and Argento has used all of the rest of the film to bring us into, you know, her perspective. And by seeing it, being immersed in it like that and seeing it through her eyes, it does become a little creepier. Just because we know, you know, she's the protagonist and they're the bad guys doesn't make it less spooky for her in the context of the film.
I mean, I suppose so, but like I said, like, we already know that she's in danger, so, and we already know that there's witches at work, so that there's no real revelation in that scene. It would be one thing, like, if they had plans specifically for her. They're gonna kill her because they need a human sacrifice to do such and such, or, you know, they're gonna possess her or something, like, anything like that, then it would, I think that moment would be stronger because, yeah, she's known that she's in danger, but now she knows what the stakes are, and instead it's just them being like, kill the American bitch, she has to die. Okay.
I mean, the stakes are her living or dying.
I mean, I guess, but yeah, it's from her perspective, but we're still sitting in the theater watching it. Like, it doesn't draw you in so much that, like, we already know her life's in danger. Everybody around her has been killed. Like, that has been the stakes the entire time. So what's the point of a revelation if it doesn't reveal anything new, you know?
I mean, to the audience, yeah, it doesn't. But, I mean, I feel like it works more in context of Susie's arc, I guess you could say. I don't know. It didn't really bother me that much. I mean, on top of that, it, you know, like we said before, it's a fairy tale story in a lot of ways. So, like, the explicit explanations on why they want to do such and such the lack of that didn't really bother me.
Yeah, except for the fact that a couple of scenes prior, they have a really obnoxious exposition dump where she goes to meet this, like, psychoanalyst or whatever who studies the delusions of people believing in witches, and he just gives her all this information about witches and, like, oh, they're evil and they gain material wealth by hurting people. It's like,
yeah, that scene was super unnecessary. Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Maybe it would have, maybe that scene where she comes across the coven at the end would have been more effective if you hadn't had that before, because then it's just like, okay, you're at this point in the movie, here's your antagonist, here's what they're doing, except they're not really doing anything. Here's really flimsy motivation. Like, what is the point of what is happening here?
The one thing I will give that scene is it's brief in comparison, especially, and we'll get into this when we talk about the next movie, in comparison to the Doctor in the new one. Like, after watching the new one, I was like, you know what? Like, even though the original has the Doctor with an exposition dump, at least he wasn't in the whole movie.
I mean, yeah,
investigating and stuff.
I guess so, but I still think it's, even in the original, having him there is really unnecessary.
Out of place.
Especially because they treat that also sort of like a revelation, because that's the first time that they really start talking about witches, but throughout the rest of the movie, at times in the goblin theme, there'll just be a voice that goes, witch.
Yeah.
So it's like...
well, the movie is not
so-
aiming for subtlety at any point.
Right.
And that's very clear.
It's definitely not subtle. And so once again, that scene even feels unnecessary because thanks to the score, we know that there are witches here. So, I don't know. Those are like the narrative things that I think that Argento is capable of doing better that he didn't, because
I've always thought Argento's weakest point was his story, like stories. I think he works best in style and conveying ideas more so than like stories.
I mean, I don't know. I think movies like Opera and Deep Red have pretty engaging narratives. I mean, once again, those are more like murder mystery films, but I think he's good at revealing new information and stuff like that. I think those films do have pretty strong narratives. And I
think the best parts of both of those films are told visually more so than they are with like straight up dialogue and narrative.
I mean, I guess, and that also has something to do with the dubbing and, having people who don't really speak English that well dubbing English lines and stuff like that. So, no, I can see where you're coming from in that sense, but...
One of the strongest visual scenes in Suspiria that I do want to talk about a little bit, because I think it's one of the most effectively scary scenes, is the maggot scene.
Yeah, I'll agree with that.
Jessica Harper is combing her hair, and maggots start falling from the ceiling.
Well, first she starts like finding maggots like in her comb, like as she's combing her hair.
Well, right before you see them fall, it's very subtle. Like, I didn't catch it the very first time I saw it.
Yeah, I don't know if I caught that either, but I do, like, she looks down and there's, like, a maggot squirming in the teeth of her comb, and then she freaks out and, like, starts going through her hair, and then she looks up and they're falling from the ceiling. I do think that is a pretty legitimately effective scene just because it's gross. Like, maggots are creepy crawly. And they go up into the attic, and there's just a shitload of them up there, just like thousands and thousands of maggots. I'll definitely agree with you on that one. That one's probably...
And I think the heightened style of it made it more nightmarish in a lot of ways.
Sure.
Because when you go up to the attic, it's all like blue filtered.
Right.
The camera work, it gives us some punch-ins and some close-ups of these maggots just infesting the... But
I do think that for a scene that I will agree is probably the most effective in the movie, it happens pretty early on. So I feel kind of like they blow their load a little bit with how well done that scene is, and then nothing quite lives up to it for the rest of the movie.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think they have a lot of other good, effective scenes and bits of storytelling like that, like tableaus of sorts. Like, you have that, you have I think the blind man getting bitten by a seeing eye dog is not bad. I think that's a pretty good scene. I think the scene where they're counting footsteps once again is a really effective scene. The kind of pans through the hallways are very unnerving, and they say a lot without really saying anything specific in terms of narrative. Yeah, I think there's a lot of really effective scenes throughout this movie. Ultimately, I agree with you that like the story is the weakest element, but I think it works in spite of that.
I don't know. I agree with like there being nice tableaus and that the visuals do a lot to build atmosphere. It's just so hard for me to care about what's happening in those set pieces a lot of times. Just because like I think a lot of the characters are kind of stupid too. Like we should clarify that in the original version of this film, Argento had planned on using like 12-year-old girls, like actual children, and then the studio didn't want these sort of like really violent, dark themes with like children, so they, made them young women. So like you can look at it that way and sort of explain away some of the childishness of some of the characters, but it's just so corny a couple of times.
Yeah, but I mean, it felt more it added to the fairy tale element for me. The childlike element kind of added to the surrealness of it.
I disagree with a lot of that. Like when after the maggot scene, when they have to set up the makeshift dormitory in like the dance studio or the gym or whatever, and they have like all these sheets set up, and they set up a bed for Helena Marcos, and she comes down and lays behind the sheet right behind Susie and Sarah, and she's like wheezing, and we can see like her silhouette red lit, and they're just lying there in bed, and they're like, do you hear that snoring? Where's it coming from? It's like, it's right fucking behind you. It's literally right behind you. You can see the silhouette of the person right fucking behind you. And then later when Susie is like drugged and she's talking to Sarah, and she's like, oh, the teachers aren't leaving the school at night because the door is to the left and the footsteps are going off to the right. And Sarah's like, you're a genius. Why didn't I think of that before? Like, that's also super obvious. And it's just like these,
in a literal sense, in a very literal sense, it doesn't work. But like, if you look at it as an expressive, not literal sense of them representing what's going on, I think it works a little better.
It's so hard for me to not look at that literally, though. And even in like when Sarah dies in the room full of razor wire, which is an interesting tableau and visually pretty effective, but like she's come through the window and she's standing on like a crate off the floor, and then she just jumps off of it without looking down and just jumps into this massive like pool of barbed wire that would have been really obvious had she just looked down, and she just blindly leaps into it.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's that literal sense. I feel like the idea was it wasn't there through her perspective, but since she's dealing with witches, it was just all of a sudden when she jumped down.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that doesn't come across to me at all, though. I don't know. It's hard to not look at some of the stuff literally, and I think once again that goes back to it not being minimal enough. Like, if they're really trying to be so dreamlike and atmospheric, then they should really go like as minimal as possible with the dialogue and the story.
Yeah, I don't know. I just never felt like the story was that excessive outside of the exposition dump with the doctor. Like, I feel like it doesn't really overstay its welcome. We get a steady pace of set pieces throughout that break it up.
I think it does too much like writing a line in the middle. I think it just really needs to go one way or another to be more effective. And I think that the climax is kind of anticlimactic as well in a way that disappoints me when Susie does stumble across Helena Marcos's room and Marcos turns invisible and she like brings back Sarah as a zombie, and it looks like Susie's really in danger, but then she sees like the outline of Marcos in the bed and just stabs her in the neck without anything happening prior to that. Yeah. And then the coven is defeated because you kill the head witch and it kills the rest of the witches, and then she just runs out. Like it's
very abrupt. I do really like having Sarah come back.
I do too.
You know, with her throat cut and stuff.
And she's got like pins in her eyes.
Yeah.
Like that design is really cool. And I would have liked that to be more of either like a chase or a fight or a struggle or something. Because really all it is Sarah just comes through the door and she has a knife and she's slowly walking towards Sarah or towards Susie. And then Susie just stabs Helena Marcos in the neck and then that's it. Like she so easily defeats these witches, like beings that we're supposed to believe are like all powerful, and they don't seem like that much of a threat if they're so easily defeated. And then she runs out into the rain and, you know, she's safe and the whole ordeal is over.
Yeah.
And that the safety and the ease at which she defeats the witches doesn't feel earned, I don't think. I think it
definitely feels abrupt.
It should have been harder. It should have been more of a toll on Susie, I think, than it is.
I agree that the ending isn't the strongest and it's pretty abrupt, but I feel like the strength lies in the journey more so than the resolution in this movie. Because I agree the final sequence is kind of weak, but I think, you know, up to the point where she actually stabs Marcos, I think it's not bad. I think it's somewhat well done, you know, with her going in the hallway and Sarah coming back and her feeling overwhelmed. The conclusion is, you know, like you said, kind of weak, where it's just a stab and run away.
Yeah, well, and I also think that, like, if you're talking about it in terms of the journey, like, not all that much happens to Sarah or to Susie in this movie. Like, we get a few people dying, but none of that happens while Susie is around. Like, everybody else who dies in the movie, you know, dies on their own in a separate scene. And other than getting attacked by the bat in her room, like, not that much actually happens to Susie.
Well, yeah, no, it happens around her. And we get, you know, these very stylized scenes where we see what happens. You could even argue that, like, a lot of times when we're seeing what happens to these other people, we're seeing Susie's imagination or interpretation of what happened to these people.
I mean, maybe, but still, I don't feel like by the end Susie has been on that much of a journey. You know, she's our protagonist, sure, but it doesn't feel like much has actually happened to her until the end. And then, like I said, she you know, defeats the witches very, very easily. So it's like, I don't even feel like there's that much of an arc for her, because she's sort of just like there while these other things happen in the school that we as the audience see, but she does not. So I don't know. Once again, all of my problems with this movie come down to the story, because I can't reinforce enough like how visually stunning this movie is. It is really, really fucking nice to look at, and seeing it on the big screen is cool, especially in a restored print. Like, it looked fucking great, and the sound design is great, and the music is great. So like, if you want to sit and watch like an 80-minute Goblin music video, then I think it's good for that. But as a narrative, I don't think it has all that much merit.
I would agree that the story itself, on a literal level, is the weakest element of it, but I think there's a lot of elements of visual storytelling that work well. And I think limiting it to just a Goblin music video is selling it a little short, because I think it, as a package, it does more than that. With its visual sense of style.
I mean, I guess, but like, music videos are very much about visual storytelling and having, you know, visual representations of what the song is about, whether, even if, you know, it's not a direct translation of the lyrics or whatever, like, it's supposed to be a visual accompaniment to the music. And I think that that's what Suspiria does the best, is it makes a good visual accompaniment to the score.
See, I think it's the other way around. I think the Goblin score works really well as an accompaniment to the visuals, and it adds to the fantasy and the fairy tale esque, with the little chimes at the beginning of the score.
I mean, yeah, the main theme is very fairy tale esque. I think it's kind of like a lullaby almost. And I like that Goblin has different variations on that main theme that it uses throughout the movie, so it doesn't get too repetitive. Because overall it's a pretty simplistic melody, hence why it gets stuck in your head so easily. From that standpoint, I think that, it does a really good job of creating that atmosphere and that mood. I just don't give a fuck about the story at all, and in that sense, I think it's kind of boring. Do you want to go ahead and rate this? Because I feel like we're starting to go in circles a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I agree that the story is the weakest element of this movie, but I think on an experiential level, it is incredible. The style is incredible. The sound design, the score are incredible. The set pieces are often incredible. The camera work and the sense of unease the total package gives you is really unique and unmatched in a lot of ways. The story is bare thin and very childlike and fantasy and fairy tale and dream-like almost. But that didn't bother me. I can understand on a first viewing being taken aback by that stuff and not being that into it. But I think if you do go out to see this movie, I would absolutely recommend not paying too much attention to the story and instead letting the feeling and the emotions and the expressionism of the movie kind of encompass you and take you in and immerse you, because I think that's where the strongest suit of this movie really is. And I would give this movie a 4 out of 5. I think it's really pretty good.
Yeah, I was hoping when I went into this movie that I would get more out of it on a second viewing, but in fact the opposite happened, and I liked it less the second time I saw it. I do think that it has sort of unparalleled aesthetic, just the combination of everything, the way it's shot, the way it's lit, the art design and so on and so forth, and the Goblin score that we've talked about ad nauseum is all really strong. But outside of that, it does not have a lot to offer, in my opinion. I've compared it a couple of times to the works of Nicholas Winding Refn, where it's all style and no substance. It's much less pretentious than his movies, so I find it less frustrating, but I have a lot of the same problems with Suspiria as I do with stuff like Only God Forgives or The Neon Demon. I'm gonna give it a 2.5 out of 5, right down the middle, because I definitely can't take away from its aesthetic, but everything else I can do without. So that'll give the original Suspiria an average rating of 3.3 out of 5 pods. And now we're gonna move on to the new one that just came out, and continuing our contentious episode, our roles were reversed in this movie. I thought this movie was excellent, and you did not like it very much.
Yeah, this movie was a mess. It was a 2.5 hour tonal mess. Yeah, so I guess we can kind of go over the basics. This movie came out this year, just about a week ago. a little less.
Yeah, just a few days ago.
It was directed by Luca Guadagnino.
Guadagnino, I think.
Something like that.
Who last year did Call Me By Your Name, Call Me By Your Boyfriend's Name, or whatever. A film that I still have not seen, but I know a lot of people really loved.
I
know
hated
you did
that
not.
movie.
I have not gone out of my way to see it because I kind of think that I will also not like it. It doesn't particularly seem like my jam. I don't really like love stories in terms of films. I think they're kind of boring. But I went into this movie with no expectations. I saw one trailer, and obviously we talked about an article written about it a few months ago, when they showed one specific scene to a group of people at a luncheon, and people were like getting up and leaving because it was so grotesque and stuff. So other than that, I went into this movie knowing relatively nothing. And I think that maybe because I don't really like the original Suspiria, that I was more accepting of this movie in general, because it's really very, very different in a lot of ways. I think it's kind of the opposite of the original Suspiria, where much more focus is put on the narrative and the storytelling and the characters, and it's much less outwardly stylistic. It does get stylistic, especially over time. There's kind of an escalation of the surrealism and the dreaminess, but it's nothing like what Argento did in terms of style. So in that sense, I think these movies are kind of polar opposites, which probably explains why we each feel opposite about them.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like one of the core problems in this movie is you can tell Guadagnino has strong love for the original in a lot of ways, and I think that's almost kind of its shortcoming, because I feel like this movie is tonally all over the place and a mess, and it never seems to know what it really wants to be. It just kind of throws a bunch of different subplots at the wall, a ton of different, ideas and even tones at the wall, and I think none of them are developed quite well enough to really let any of them shine in particular. For example, you have a lot of different subplots in this movie that I thought were fairly unnecessary.
I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I don't think there's a lot of different subplots. I think
you have the Bader Minhoff, you have the Holocaust stuff.
You have I think a lot of that is not so much subplot as it is building the setting. But
they give so much emphasis on, say, let's start with the Bader Meinhof stuff. They give that stuff so much emphasis in the movie that you're to assume that it's working towards the themes of the movie. And if it was trying to make a point with that stuff, it was over my head because it didn't make any sense why it was connected to anything that was going on in the movie.
I think that was, once again, I think that served more for setting the world that the story takes place in, because I think the Bader Meinhof stuff is the reason why there wasn't more like police involvement in the shit that was happening and the deaths and stuff like that, because...
But the social realism angle didn't really work for me, because I feel like the best social realist movies use that kind of stuff to work towards ideas, and if it's just solely towards world building, I feel like it's kind of half-baked at its core. And I feel like on top of that, the social realism was totally at odds with, the more extreme expressionistic stuff in this movie.
I disagree, actually, because I think that the setting for this film is very important, because having it set in Cold War Berlin in the late 70s, which is the same setting as the original, but the original doesn't address that at all. I think the particular like time and place that it's in, and that the Coven of Witches has been around since before World War II. So they went through World War II in Berlin, and then, you know, saw the divide after, with the separation of the city and the country, you know, into the, you know, communist East and the democratic, quote unquote, West. I think that world building is important for why the Coven is doing what they're doing and the way they behave, and fleshing out their motivations.
But I think even that stuff was half-baked, because it didn't properly add that towards motivations in any sort of clear way. And this movie does a really weird thing where, like, it leaves stuff up, quote unquote, to interpretation. I would say it just loosely throws stuff at the wall. And it goes between that and just explicitly, you know, explaining what is going on.
It does over-explain some things a little bit too much. I agree with that. I do think that at times it could just trust its audience to figure out what's happening a little bit more than explicitly spelling it out.
Yeah, there's a couple of moments where it gets really egregious when they're like, oh, we're giving Susie dreams, you know, like, we could have, like, interpreted that, you know. Or for example, there's an awesome sequence where they tell Susie to improvise a dance, and we get that intercut with shots of Marco's under the floorboards, like, reaching up towards the floor, and you get this balance between, like, Susie writhing on the floor and Marco's underneath. And I thought that intercut was super cool and really well done. But in the immediate next scene, they're like, why did you put Marco's under the floor?
Yeah,
you know?
no, I will totally give you that. The over explanation of a few of those things is really very, very unnecessary. And I guess we can go ahead and get into my biggest problem with the movie in terms of the subplots, which I think is the only major subplot, and it just does not work at all, because it's so completely irrelevant to the rest of the film.
And that's the thing, you know, because they give it almost an hour of the film's running time, I would say, probably altogether.
Yeah, and no, I agree, and that's what keeps me from considering the new Suspiria almost a perfect film, is because that subplot is so disjointed. You have this like old psychiatrist who we see at the beginning talking with Chloe Grace Moretz, who has run away from the academy, and she's like crazy and talking about witches and stuff. But then you have him sort of investigating the academy for the rest of the movie, but none of his investigation has any sort of really direct impact on the plot. And there's all this stuff about him feeling guilty about the disappearance of his wife back in the war, because she had to flee Nazi Germany because they didn't like fill out her Aryan papers in time or whatever. And I kept waiting for this to come around and somehow be relevant to the main plot about Susie and the academy and the witches, and it never fucking was. Even by the end, it had zero impact on the actual plot. And it is given like a collective 45 minutes to an hour of screen time.
Yeah, it feels like they were trying really hard to, you know, give this subplot that added to the themes and ideas of the movie,
but it didn't.
It didn't, and
no.
It just made the rest of the movie unclear. And I think the movie kind of grinds to near a halt and kind of kills the tension of the movie whenever that stuff is going on.
Yeah, I can agree that it does get boring at those times. And another very confusing decision about that is that the old man is played by Tilda Swinton in old man makeup.
Yeah.
For no reason.
No reason at all. I think the makeup is pretty good, but at the same time, like...
It's effective. Like, she does look like an old man, but it was bothering me the entire movie because, like, they still use Tilda Swinton's voice. So the whole time I was thinking, like, why does this old man have, like, a lady's voice? Like, it was just bothering me. And I'm like, is that a lady in old man makeup? And I kept looking, I'm like, wait a second, is that Tilda Swinton? And I looked at the IMDb page after we got out of the movie, and sure enough, it was. And I can't think of a reason why they made that decision. Because not only is the character completely irrelevant and meaningless to the central plot, but also why go to the trouble of doing Tilda Swinton up in really complicated, really good makeup for such a pointless character.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing with several points in this movie is I feel like it's yelling at the audience. We're an artistic movie. We're trying to say something deep. But it doesn't seem like they really know what they're trying to say a lot of times. I feel like the most effective parts are the parts where the director allows himself to just go into schlockier, more visceral sequences, where it's like the original, more expressive and, you know, gets at that feeling and emotion more than like literally spelling the story out. Because in a lot of ways, I feel kind of similar to how you do with the original. I think the story is kind of the weakest point in this, and I feel like they could have gone two ways with this one, much like you were saying with the original. They could have either focused their narrative and really taken one core idea and really pinned on it and, you know, kind of cut a lot of the fat out, or they could have pulled a lot of the story and let more of the scenes speak for themselves. And I feel like since it's riding that ground, it doesn't really effectively do either one.
I would say that I actually think the narrative, the core narrative, I'm putting aside the psychiatrist stuff, but like the core narrative I think is actually done pretty effectively. I think it's much more developed than in the original. I think the characters are much more developed and have actual motivations. They don't set any sort of pretenses that this movie might not be about witches. They let you in on that fact pretty early on in the movie.
But my problem is they don't hone on one idea. You know, they have the character study of Susie. They have the witches trying to summon. They have Sarah's story, and these three kind of through lines clash in a lot of ways.
I disagree. I think they all,
because I feel like they're not developed enough. Any of the stories on their own.
I disagree. I think that the three of them work pretty well together in tandem. I think that there's a couple of abrupt shifts in perspective that are a little bit jarring, because at a certain point it sort of shifts perspective from Susie to Sarah, and there's not really a super effective transition between those two. But the two on their own, I don't have a problem with. I like that there's motivational backstory for Susie's character, having left her family, who is Amish,
Mennonite, yeah.
Yeah, and being obsessed with dance and obsessed with this particular dance company. She's seen Tilda Swinton dance in New York 3 times. She's ran away from the Amish each of those times to go see her and was punished, and so has been like, she wants to leave that really strict lifestyle and go and make something of herself. So there you have the more motivation for her.
I mean, I think the backstory of that works well, but the arc in the movie doesn't work. She starts, afraid of what's going on, and then suddenly she's complicit in it to the point where she's speaking telepathically to...
Well, she's coming into herself through the tutelage of Tilda Swinton's character.
But I feel like the arc is so sloppy because it's so abrupt when it goes from her as an unwilling, unknowing participant to her just in on it, and like to the point where she's going out with the witches and speaking telepathically. I mean, only in the act before that, only less than 15 minutes before that, she was nervous about Sarah being gone. She was worried about the bizarre cop thing she saw.
Yeah, but she's being, this whole time she's being like magically groomed, because the Coven wants to have her be the new vessel for their leader Marcos, who is dying. So they're trying to magically groom her to be the new vessel. And so Tilda Swinton is sort of like working with her personally under the pretense of like teaching her to dance. But it's obvious that for this Coven running a dance academy, that the dances are integral to their rituals. So I think there's a lot of...
I understand why it's done.
Well, yeah, but it feels like there's a lot of magical brainwashing happening, that they're exerting their influence on her as witches in a way that they're drawing something out of her that has remained locked away for her whole life under this really strict sort of totalitarian Christian, Amish upbringing.
Well, I just think the shift between that is not developed in the movie. It's just an abrupt shift from one end to the other.
Yeah, to an extent, I can agree with that.
And I think that's why the arc fails. I mean, I think the backstory makes sense, and the shift, if it was there, it would have been really good. I mean, I think that the shift is not there. It's so abrupt.
I agree that the transition is sloppy, but I don't think that the entire arc fails because the shift is sloppy. I don't think that like overwrites everything else that the movie has been doing.
I think if they would have taken the time to actually make it a transformation rather than just making it an abrupt shift, it would have worked so much better for me.
I'll give you that. Like they definitely could have developed that shift better, but I think by the time you get the revelation at the end of who Susie actually is to the Coven, that it makes some of that a little more forgivable for me. It's still definitely not perfect, but in a movie that's already 2.5 hours long, like...
But I mean, like, if it's trying to do a character study, like, the point is showing that transformation. It isn't just showing the background and why a transformation would work if they did it. You have to actually do it. I think it shows a fair amount of transformation, but there is sort of a jump where it's on like a gradual upswing, and then all of a sudden it just kind of skyrockets. But I don't think it goes from 0 all the way to 100 in the change between one scene to the next. It feels like it's missing the whole second act of that arc, though. And the second act is usually the biggest section. It jumps from the very beginning of that shift to, oh, she's full on ready to go. And I feel like it felt so sloppy.
I mean, but the dance that they're working on specifically is, a dance that Tilda Swinton and the rest of the witches have choreographed together, so it's obviously ritualistic, and we see so much of Susie working on that dance, and she's playing the protagonist in the dance, so she's really the central element, and there's so much development of her, perfecting that choreography, and at times railing against it, trying to say, wouldn't it be better if I did such and such at this time, but then, being told very, hard, like, no, you have to do this exactly one way. And I think that the progression of her mastering the dance is a lot of that transformation of her being brought into the coven. And that's one of the times where they don't overstate that explicitly, which I think is the correct way to do it, because it allows you to...
They don't overstate it, but they don't develop it either, I don't think. I think it's very half-baked. I mean, she starts as a great dancer, and she continues through the movie as a great dancer, even though at one point she, wants to do one of the moves differently. Like, she gets shut down immediately about that.
I mean, she has great natural talent, which is why they select her in the first place, but she definitely doesn't do it perfectly to start with. There is a lot of her working on specific things. They want her to work on her jumps specifically, and the first couple of the very first time she does it, she collapses halfway through it. So, there definitely is an arc, I think.
Well, that's one of those sequences where I thought the magic was really half-baked, because it feels like they were trying to, bring magic upon through the height of the jumps. You even get it with the other person jumping, and then immediately after they're done, when they're all walking out, they collapse and start foaming at the mouth or whatnot.
Yeah, because I think the idea with that was the witches transferring the other girl's jumping ability into Susie, kind of a transference of power, because we see a lot of that in the movie, like that first time she dances where Tilda Swinton touches her hands and her feet, and then it's intercut with the other girl down in the mirrored room being telepathically thrown around and twisted up into a really gross, nasty human pretzel.
I thought that scene was incredible. I thought the CG of the glowing,
the little bit of a glow on her hands
was kind of goofy.
A little bit. I didn't think it was too overdone. It looked a little bit goofy, but I think it was subtle enough that it didn't bother me terribly. I do think that scene is one of the strongest in the movie, especially in the way that it's cut between the two, and how you have, the music in the ones when it's Susie dancing, and then it cuts to the other girl being thrown around, and there's no music, so you can hear the sounds of her bones breaking and shit, and it's really quite visceral.
It's brutal.
That was the scene that we had talked about from the article several months ago, and I can see why people watching that over lunch were losing their appetites and getting up and leaving.
A bunch of people who had no idea what they were getting into after Call Me By Your Name.
Right. And that is one of the things that I think this movie does really well, is the horror atmosphere and stuff, I think is really strong.
I think when it does spectacle, when it does those very unflinching, brutal, visceral scenes, it's the strongest point of the movie. The problem I have with the atmosphere is it doesn't build tension to those points, because after every scene, basically, of those, it eventually cuts back to the Tilda Swinton doctor, professor character, and kills any, energy that the movie had.
Those particular scenes are quite devoid of tension. I will agree, but I I think that when it is still focusing on the stuff in the dance academy with what the witches are doing and Sarah's investigation, I think all of that stuff is pretty good at building tension, but it's quiet enough that it makes the really brutal scenes more effective because they are so gruesome and so standout, and having a lot of like quiet moments in between them makes those escalations a lot more effective.
Well, let's talk about the mystery with Sarah a little bit more. So, unlike the original Suspiria, where Sarah had Susie to bounce off of to not be in this mystery alone, Sarah's basically alone trying to figure the stuff out. And I think that's kind of a shortcoming of it because she doesn't have the stuff to bounce it off. It feels like she's making these jumps in logic where she's following footsteps over like 2 floors into
that was a little bit
room.
That's something that I think was a bit too much of a nod to the original following the footsteps, because it did make a little less sense in this movie because she was counting the footsteps over such vast distances.
Yeah.
I think they could have found better ways for her to discover the witch's inner sanctum. But I think when she does, that those scenes are quite effective.
Yeah, but that's like the climax of that subplot, I would argue. The whole rest of it is really messy in its execution. I think when they do start with her and Susie, looking for clues in the office, for example.
Yeah, they break into the office to try to find the files of the missing girls. Yeah.
And while Sarah's looking for stuff, Susie sneaks into the next room where she hears something, and she sees a bunch of the witches laughing maniacally and playing around with this hypnotized cop.
Yeah, and like tickling his dick with like a large metal hook. I did think that was weird. Not specifically that scene itself, but the fact that Susie leaves the room and goes back to Sarah and says nothing about it. Like, she doesn't seem taken aback by discovering this at all.
Yeah.
That was definitely a little weird.
It felt like it was so out of place with the mystery of that.
But what I like about Susie's transition and how it sort of ends up with her falling away from Sarah is that she and Sarah start out very close, like they become friends really quickly. And to the point where like Susie's having a night terror and Sarah comes to comfort her and they like lay down in bed together. And there's, to an extent, I think some homoerotic undertones there, which makes sense for, Susie being repressed as a child and a virgin and sort of like coming into herself. It's like a coming of age thing. But then as she's coming more under the influence of the witches, she's more brushing Sarah aside when Sarah really needs her. So I think that their separation actually works because it shows the witch's influence working on Susie and Sarah having to investigate and discover these horrible things on her own when she should have her friend by her side.
The thing is, it's not an investigation though, really. In a similar way to the original, she ends up talking to the doctor who just gives her an info dump.
Right.
And like the other big investigation scene we get is her following the footsteps, which once she gets down to the sanctum, it's a really effective scene, but there's no sense of discovery or, investigation really. It's just taking her to that set piece, like there's no arc in that either.
Yeah, that arc is somewhat half-baked. Like, it's established that she was Chloe Grace Moretz' friend before all this happened, so she's concerned and wants to figure out what happened, which is why they break into the office in the first place. But yeah, the stuff with the doctor coming to her and being like, oh, your friend was obsessed with witches, and then Sarah's just like, whatever, fuck you, that's stupid. and then she discovers the witches and goes back to the doctor and be like, witches. That stuff was unnecessary and stupid.
Yeah, well, and I think that's like the core of what I'm trying to get at is like there's a lot of arcs that have a strong context behind them, but I think they're trying to do so many different arcs with this that they don't give any single arc proper time to develop and become focused.
I just think that the three main arcs in the central story are like interconnected well enough that stuff didn't bother me terribly. Also, just because we learn more about the characters and we get to know them more, so I think you care about, or at least I did, I cared about Susie and Sarah. I mean, more so than I did in the original. The fact that we had context
didn't change the fact that they didn't develop for me, really. Like in the sense of the narrative arc progressing in a satisfying way, and I think even with the witches subplot, that the arc was kind of muddied by things like one of the witches suddenly stabbing themselves in the neck for basically no reason, or this power dynamic between Marcos and Blanche, which is not properly, I feel like, developed quite enough. I wanted to see a bit more struggle in that kind of power dynamic.
I don't think you can do that without revealing Marcos as a character too early on, because I what I like about that is that there's constantly the discussion between the coven, like who's in charge, and they have the part at the beginning where they all vote on, who remains in power, and Marcos wins over Blanc by like 3 votes, but Marcos is absent, so we've got this sort of like nebulous leader of the coven who we don't know anything about, and she's mysterious, and the most we see of her before the end of the movie is like her hand, touching the bottom of the floorboard when Susie's dancing, and it's all like rotten and has like these long talon-like fingernails. So, I mean, if you've seen the original, like, basically who the character is, but in that stuff, I didn't have a problem with it because, yeah, there's a power struggle dynamic, but for the whole movie, Tilda Swinton seems like she's the one in charge, but she can't really make any of the decisions because there is somebody over her.
Well, yeah, the power dynamic was there, but they didn't build it up well enough. I think, like you said, the only time we saw Marcos was under the floorboards, and they, explicitly lay it out that was Marcos under the floorboards.
Well, yeah, that's too much over-explanation.
If it was more of a dynamic between what she is told people to do, and what Blanc wants to do, I think they had a little bit of that, but it was still kind of half-baked. It wasn't fully developed. It wasn't fully given the time to gestate, I think, in the movie, just because I think he really wanted to keep that bit of mystery, but I think the fact that it was juggling that mystery with laying things out explicitly and several different other storylines, it just feels unfocused and messy.
I don't know. I think that there's actually a lot of development there with them saying early on that like Marcos wants Susie to be her new vessel, and they're like, we have to do the ritual or whatever now, and Tilda Swinton is like, no, not, it's too soon, the last one failed, like we have to actually take the time to properly groom this girl and get her ready. And a big part of that is making her willing to do it. But through the course of her becoming close with Susie, we start to see that Tilda Swinton is second guessing actually making her the new vessel for Marcos. So that's development for Blanc's character, and she starts to become more unwilling, and then leading up to the climax when Susie herself seems very willing, and Tilda Swinton is now all of a sudden the one with doubts about it. I think that sort of shift between the two of them is interesting.
The problem I have is you assume Chloe Grace Moretz's character is the one that they were trying to make a vessel before. Right. And she has just gone crazy because of it.
Right.
In a way you see none of in Susie, really.
Well, right, but there's also, because aside from being at the dance academy, Chloe Grace Moretz was also very politically active. They talk all the time about her wanting to fight the regime in Berlin, and talks about her, meeting with like resistance people. So ultimately she was unwilling to be groomed to become the new vessel for Marcos, and she was resisting it, which is what caused her to go crazy.
I guess, but I feel like that stuff wasn't done very clearly. Because
I thought it was pretty clear to me, I guess.
Well, it was in there, but I think it juggled between being an excuse for them to kill her and the fact that we didn't see any of Chloe Grace Moretz outside of that one scene. It felt like we needed to take these context clues of what other people said to be her character rather than her actually having a complex character. We didn't get any sort of flashbacks of her.
Yeah, I guess,
else.
But like in the opening scene when she goes to the doctor, like I think we see enough of what all of this has done to her in the way that she's behaving with the doctor, and then to have her vanish and have, her disappearance be one of the mysteries, particularly what Sarah is trying to investigate because they were friends, but have her be like totally gone.
Sarah was super resistant to the idea that she was really political.
Yeah, she was, but they were still close. They were still friends.
Yeah, so how was she political if Sarah was close to her and saying she wasn't that political? Like it's at odds with each other, and like on top of that, I think
I don't think Sarah was saying that she wasn't political. I think she was just saying she didn't agree with Chloe Grace Moritz's sort of revolutionary ideas. I don't think she ever denied that she was that person. She just didn't agree with it. And that's, the excuse they keep having for her going missing is like, oh, she must have just run off and is now like bombing shit, To have Sarah sort of be like, I don't think that that's what happened to her. I think there's something else happening, something else happened to her.
I had trouble with the political angle that this movie took, especially with the social realistic kind of tones it was taking. I feel like, again, it was trying to say something, but not really coherently saying anything. Like, what does it mean that because she was active politically, she was resistant to magic? What is that actually saying?
Well, it's because I don't know if it's saying something explicitly, but it shows that she was not as passionate about dance as someone like Susie was, which made her more of the ideal candidate for their grooming because she wanted to be the best. She wanted to be the protagonist in this dance. And, this was everything that her life had been building up to, whereas Chloe Grace Moretz had different things that she was really passionate and concerned with. And maybe she did start out as being more into the dance, but at living in Berlin with all of the stuff that was happening politically, that she sort of moved away from the dance and into more, political concerns, and that's what made her so resistant to the grooming.
So I like the idea of passion and dedication to art is the concept they were going out with it, would you say?
I mean, maybe, but like I said before, like obviously the act of dance and the ritual of dance is integral to these witches' magic. So I think that if somebody is not truly committed to the dance and to the movements and doing everything just right like they need for their rituals, then it makes it harder. Whereas Susie's character is, willing to the point that she'll even like abandon her friend Sarah because she's so dedicated to dancing.
Yeah, I just feel like for a 2.5 hour movie that screams, we're an art film, look at our subtext, like look at what we're trying to say, especially with, the Holocaust doctor subplot and the Bader Meinhof stuff. Like, it's not actually trying to say something super coherent with, what it's
I didn't get the idea that it was trying to make any sort of socio-political statement. I again think that was just important to setting the stage for what was happening in the dance academy, whereas you've got this really, hyper realistic setting and reasons for the way the world is where they are, but at the same time you've got this isolated dance academy where it's not hyper realistic because there's magic happening. So I think all of the political stuff and the setting is just primarily giving a world for this magical story to take place in, set as sort of an opposing backdrop, but still having an effect upon the world.
I just don't buy that because it's given almost an hour plus of the movie's runtime.
I do really think that the whole doctor subplot is just so wildly unnecessary. Like that it does sort of drag the movie down at a lot of moments because it is 2.5 hours. Well, and if you cut out that whole subplot, I think the rest of the movie would be much tighter and more focused.
And I even think if it was more coherently connected to the themes and the subplot or subtext of the movie, I think it would have worked better. But the fact that it didn't really connect to the rest of it smoothly or coherently, it muddied the rest of the movie for me.
Well, that subplot is definitely the film's biggest shortcoming. I would honestly very much like to see an edit of this movie with that whole subplot removed and see how the film stands. But, that being said, despite that whole subplot, I thought the rest of the movie was so well done that it ultimately didn't harm my enjoyment of the film too much. Like, it is 2.5 hours long, but I don't think I was ever really bored. There were times where I thought that things were kind of dull, but every time it would, take me back to the academy and show me more of that progression with Susie and Tilda Swinton and stuff, that it just won me over again.
I think if this movie, instead of being 2.5 hours plus long, it was an hour and a half, and instead of 6 acts plus an epilogue, it was a more limited story in 3 or 4 acts, I think it would have been much more effective. I think if they would have focused on just 1 or 2 of these arcs that they're trying to do and really hone in on it and give it weight and give it the full transformative arc that it deserves, I think the tension of the visceral horror scenes would have been elevated to what it deserves, because I feel like the visceral horror, body horror scenes in this movie are incredible. I think like we said, the mirror room scene is incredible. The scene where Sarah is discovering the bodies in the sanctum is incredible. When they're all like disfigured and amputated and stuff.
Right.
The whole final sequence is incredible.
Yeah.
But it just feels kind of flattened and dulled because we have so much other stuff in it. I feel like if it was more focused, if it would have taken more of its time to do less, it would have been more effective and it would have hit harder.
I can agree with that. It in its current form, it didn't bother me as much as it did you, but I do think that if it had a little bit more focus and some of the fat was trimmed, that it would be close to a perfect film, if not a perfect film. Where as it stands, there is a lot of fat and there's a lot of filler that I think from a filmmaking standpoint is handled adequately, but it does at times draw attention away from what the movie is really about, to its detriment.
Yeah.
I will say, in comparison to the original, I think the payoff at the end is much more satisfying and much more deserved.
Yeah, I think the payoff is really strong in this movie, and I think it, for the most part, is stronger than the original in that respect, but at the same time, it's so over the top that it kind of felt at odds with the social realism in the movie. I feel like if they would have toned down the social realism a little bit, and this might just be in the editing, if they cut out the whole doctor's stuff, it would have felt more warranted, I guess. Maybe not warranted, but like it would have felt less direct with the social realism, and I would have forgiven that abrupt shift a little bit more.
To an extent, but at the same time, I think that there is sort of a gradual escalation of surrealism in this movie that really peaks with that final scene, and I think having the backdrop of the social realism makes that surrealism almost more effective because of how starkly different they are. That you've got this very realistic, dark world that this whole magical thing is set against, and then when you get to that climax, which is just totally insane and surreal and horrifying, I think it plays as sort of a good foil for some of the realism. I still do think that all the doctor stuff could be done away with just because it feels like a completely different movie. But I think the setting honestly heightens the magical elements of the movie, because it seems like a world that magic doesn't exist in. So when magic does exist, I think it's more effective because of that.
Yeah, but the tension in discovering that is spelled out for you, which kind of kills
at times, not always, but at
which
times,
kills some of it for me. I think I've seen a lot of this comparison online, and I even mentioned it when we were going out of the theaters. I see a lot of similarities between this movie and Mother, both in the escalation of spectacle, kind of its style at times, especially with things like punch-ins and camera movement and stuff like that, as well as the idea that Mother kind of throws everything at the wall to see what sticks, and the story is one of the parts where like you either can ignore some of the details that don't make the most sense and enjoy the spectacle and the primal visceralness of the movie, or it will turn you off. And I feel like this movie is a similar way, where camera movement is really strong, the escalation is totally there, but there's a lot of details in the story where it just feels thrown on or thrown together. And if you ignore it, it'll make it a stronger film for you. But if you focus on it, it can take away from the experience.
Yeah, I can see that. The comparison to Mother is interesting for me because I really did not like Mother very much, and I liked this movie a lot. But I can see the comparison in that escalation. Maybe I just like the story that this movie is telling better than Mother. Like that might be what separates them the most for me.
Well, I'll agree. You know, I think Mother is a dumber movie than this movie.
I think it's a dumber movie that thinks it's smarter.
I don't even know if it thinks it's smarter because I think it's dumber, but that makes me forgive it more because of the spectacle and because it's about an hour shorter and it's mostly spectacle driven. Like, the story doesn't bog me down too
I
much.
guess, but man, Aronofsky is a pretentious fuck, and hearing him.
Gordiano is a
Well, I don't know because I haven't seen Call Me by Your Name, and I don't know anything about him as a director, so maybe he is a pretentious fuck. But like listening to Aronofsky talk about Mother, like it's a brilliant masterpiece of an allegory, and when it is really just kind of dumb spectacle. I don't know. I don't know much about Luca Guadagnino.
I feel like this movie is a very similar thing because he's like, this is a brilliant allegory type of thing, but you know, it's really not saying that much. I think the biggest strengths of this movie are its horror scenes, but that stuff is the strongest, but it's cut in between an hour plus of filler material.
Yeah, no, the filler is definitely problematic. I don't know. This movie doesn't feel particularly pretentious to me. It is definitely art housey. I appreciate some of the art house sensibilities in telling a horror story. The whole love story with the doctor and his missing wife, who has a cameo. It's a fucking Jessica Harper later on, but she's just an illusion or whatever. That whole thing, it just feels like a different movie. Like it's like, why are you telling me this? I'm here to watch the dance witches do some horrifying black magic.
When they were cutting to like flashbacks of him and his wife just pointing at the corner of the wall where they drew a heart and like smiling
and
at
their
it
initials
was just so corny. Oh my god.
Well, yeah, the love story thing was just so at odds with the rest of the movie, and I almost wonder if because his last film was Call Me by Your Name, if Luca Guadagnino felt the need to incorporate some kind of like heartfelt romantic angle into this movie.
I think what he was trying to do is show his love for the original by shoehorning a romance with the original lead.
Oh yeah, could be. Even though like she's only in like one scene, it's mostly just Tilda Swinton doctor.
They intercut it with some corny ass,
sure,
you know, sequences. Let's. Oh, do you have anything else?
Well, I think we should talk a little bit about the end.
Okay,
the
spoiler
climax.
zone.
Yeah, heavy spoiler zone. This revelation I actually enjoyed quite a bit. It's established earlier in the film in some sort of unnecessary exposition that there are 3 original like mother witches who, as the doctor says, predate God, whatever the fuck that means. And it's established that Marcos thinks that she is the reincarnation of one of these witches, hence why she needs a new vessel so she can live on. And when Susie comes to the ritual at the end, which is this really weird, horrifying dance number, you know, Marcos tells her, like, you have to like disavow your real mother because you only have one mother. And then it's revealed that Susie is in fact the actual reincarnation of one of these mother witches, and she like summons death and kills all of the witches who voted for Marcos over Blanc. And it's pretty spectacularly gory and stylized, and I thought overall pretty effective, and a nice subversion of that idea of her just willingly going into sacrificing herself when instead she has ascended to like who she's truly meant to be.
Yeah, I really like that too. I wish there was a little more build up to it, because you get a couple scenes where they build up to it, which I thought were really nice. Like you get her Susie's mother like on her deathbed talking about how her daughter was born of sin or whatnot.
Right.
And she looks horrified, but it doesn't really emphasize that. And, you know, that kind of adds to the surprise of it. But at the same time, if there was a little more context clues that would have added to that, I kind of was hoping for that. But I think when it does do the shift, it is visually stunning. What do you think of the red filter over everything?
At first, when it first started happening, I didn't like it, especially because it would cut between like shots of Susie and she wasn't red lit, and then the rest of the room was red lit. But then as it sort of took over and consumed everything, I thought it was actually pretty effective. It seemed like somewhat of a nod to the original with like the really oversaturated color, and to have this room completely red lit while this incarnation of death walks around making people's heads literally explode. And so there's blood everywhere, but the entire screen is already red lit, so the blood just looks black. I thought that was pretty spectacular.
Yeah.
And especially how for a lot of it it's in low frame rate slow motion, which was a decision that I was confused about at first, because, you know, there's a lot of motion blur and tracing and it looked kind of weird. But then once Susie takes her place in the middle of the room and all the dancers are like moving around her, and it transitions to a higher frame rate but still in slow motion, so all of a sudden it's really smooth and fluid. I thought that was actually really cool.
Yeah, I like that. Personally, I've never been a fan of using low frame rate slow motion.
I'm generally not either, but I think it was effective in that scene.
Yeah, I understand what they were trying to do with it, and it worked somewhat for me. Better than a couple of the other times when they used low frame rate slow motion in this movie.
Yeah, like when the doctor was walking through the snow, that was confusing.
That was weird.
That was confusing. Yeah.
I thought the Marcos creature design was really good.
Yeah, she looked like a Cronenberg-esque frog monster.
Kind of, yeah.
I thought that was really cool. Overall, I thought that final climax was so much better deserved than the original, because there was an actual revelation of new information, and it actually felt like there was present danger, not necessarily to Susie, because she is the, you know, all of a sudden the all-powerful one, so there's a reversal of roles, but it actually felt like the rest of the movie has been building up to this.
On the flip side, though, where Suspiria's ending is a little too abrupt, I feel like they give a little too much time after that.
The fucking epilogue is totally unnecessary.
100%. They should have ended with the transformation.
Agreed.
Climax
100%.
You know,
100%.
I feel like seeing the other witches in the coven clean up the blood in the basement was not good.
No, and then for Susie to go to the doctor at the very end and like reveal all the details about what actually happened to his wife, and then purge all of his memories of his wife and the coven and her and everything, that was so fucking unnecessary, and it made the climax much less effective, I think, because it gave it too much time before the credits.
Yeah.
I think if
It ties everything up too cleanly.
That wide shot of Susie in the center of the room with the people dancing around her when it transitions from low frame rate slow motion to high frame rate slow motion, that should have cut to credits.
Yeah,
at the end of that shot.
I totally agree.
I'll agree with you on that 100%.
Yeah, because it tries to tie everything up in a bow at the end with the epilogue.
Honestly,
like they even go to the other dancers and are like, Blanca's left the company suddenly.
Oh yeah, and then they cut back to her with her head almost fully cut off, but she's still alive.
Yeah.
All of that was so unnecessary. I'm almost at the point where, like, when this movie is released digitally, I almost want to download it and make my own fan edit, because I don't even feel like it would be that difficult, because there's just entire scenes that I think could be completely removed and cut it down by about an hour.
Yeah, well, I think this movie would be fantastic if it was an hour shorter too. So like, I would be interested in seeing how that would end up.
All right. Well, when it comes out digitally, I'm gonna make a fan edit in my spare time, and I'm gonna make this an even better movie. But that being said, and I'll move into ratings from this. I still really, really liked this movie. I went into it with no expectations and came out very pleasantly surprised. I think in terms of its atmosphere and style and some of its horror, it's one of my favorite movies of 2018 so far. It's not without its faults, but I think the stuff that it does so well can make some of those faults a little bit more forgivable. I overall, just because of how much I enjoyed this movie, I'm gonna give it a 4.5 out of 5 pods.
Wow. Yeah, so I did not feel the same. This movie, in my opinion, was kind of a tonal mess. It was trying very hard to say something, but it didn't know what it was trying to say coherently, I feel like. And there were so many different things it was trying to throw at the wall that it failed to succeed at any specific one. You know, it failed for me as a character study. It failed for me as a mystery. It failed for me as a drama with any sort of tension. Where it did work is these visceral scenes of spectacle, which I think are some of the strongest of the year. I just wish it was cut down to the point where it could focus on just one or two of these stories and tell it more coherently and clearly, and actually give it time to gestate and give transformation and really give the rest of the film tension and really give the scenes of visceral horror more warranted context. I think this movie was a mess. I wanted to like it. I think when it's good, it's so good that it just made the hour plus of filler content so much more excruciating for me. This film has a lot of the same problems that I have with Call Me By Your Name, ironically. Just that it gives overimportance to certain things without actually like trying to coherently say anything. Like, it's trying to emphasize that it is saying something without really going into, what that implies. When it's strong, once again, it's really strong. And I think the soundtrack, which we didn't really get to touch on, is really good. Tom York, I wanted them to bring in some of that goblin theme just because it slaps and it's so iconic.
I was surprised they
but
didn't.
The restraint was unexpected.
I do think Tom York's score was pretty damn good.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty effective and pretty restrained, though it did sound very Radiohead-esque at times. That didn't bother me too much. I would give this a 2.5 out of 5. Yeah, I think it's a mess, but when it's good, it's really good.
Okay, well, that will give the new Suspiria an average rating of 3.5 out of 5 pods. Ultimately, we felt so opposite about both films that they ended up with almost the exact same average rating. So yeah, this may have been our most divisive, contentious episode yet. I would be very curious to hear some of our listeners' thoughts on both of these movies. Especially considering that you and I are so often on mostly the same page in terms of our taste. The fact that we were so divided on both of these films really makes me curious what other people think. So yeah, hit us up on social media and tell us what you think of these two movies, which camp you're in.
I do have one thing I want to read. In lieu of not having a Metacritic corner, I have a little article that someone posted on Twitter about Luca Guadagnino, however you say his last name, that I thought was fucking hilarious, and I want to find it and read it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to read this whole thing. It's 4 screen caps. Guadagnino,
I think is how it's pronounced.
Okay, so this guy is the most Italian guy ever.
Oh, yes.
Just preface it by saying that. In light of Guadagnino's successes outside Italy, he has become known among the upper strata within it. The hosts that evening were Anna Federici and her husband, Robert D'Ignazio, who goes by Dago. Federici is an heiress to a family of Italian builders. Dago founded an Italian news site, Dago Spia, a witty, idiosyncratic blog of politics, gossip, and soft porn.
What?
Which Politico recently described as a must-read for the Italian elite.
Gotta get your soft porn.
Isn't that the most Italian elite thing, though?
Yes.
Upstairs, Dago greeted Guadagnino, wearing blue-tinted sunglasses, silver jewelry, and tattoos from the fingers to his ears. His chin sported a long Van Dyke. Federici wore interesting glasses and a chestnut bob framed by white. Guadagnino accepted a glass of rosé and wandered around. The balcony glowed with blinking neon palm trees, an enormous Christ figurine, and illuminated statues of Silvio Berlusconi and Chairman Mao.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my fucking god. That is like the most fucking Italian elite nonsense I've ever heard.
And this kind of makes me suspect of, like, Guadagnino actually trying to say anything in his movies.
Oh my god.
Because he's just throwing imagery out. He flopped into a pink love seat of 2 scoop-like concave chairs made for Veuve Clicquot, reportedly from the casting of a woman's breasts.
Okay, yep. Nope,
He's
that
sitting
makes sense.
in this big-ass titty chair.
Yeah, all right.
They were separated by a champagne bucket filled with dildos.
Okay. At this point, nothing that you're saying is surprising me. It all just fitting right into place.
Dago came over, still wearing his sunglasses and sucking on a small unlit cigar.
Okay.
He wanted to show Guadagnino New Religion, a room-sized Damien Hirst piece about faith and pharmaceuticals, which he owned.
Okay.
Yep.
Dago
is a Catholic, Guadagnino explained. He apologized in passing for the prudishness of the decor.
What? The prudishness?
Yeah,
of the titty chair and the bucket full of dildos?
And the Berlusconi Mao statues.
Yep, that sounds pretty prudish to me.
Down on the down on the lower floor that he'd converted into offices for the Dagaspia staff, he could give freer rein to his eclectic tastes.
Oh, freer
Yeah,
rein.
you ready?
Gotcha, yeah.
A wall of Sacred Heart paintings, a set of black and red leather chairs shaped like penises,
Yep.
and on a coffee table, a set of delicate fine china plates bearing close-up photographs of fellatio and a trans person being penetrated from behind.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Who are these people?
Italian elites, man.
Jesus Christ.
Dinner was served. The guest filed downstairs to the dining room, passing a nude frontal photograph of a slender man with a pendulous member.
Slender man with a big dick. Got it.
Brezhnev's cock. Excuse me, Noyarev's cock. Guadagnino said. Dago is very proud of it. The table was decorated with a brass hammer and sickle. Dago showed the dining room decor, which was printed with a life-size posterior photo of a naked blonde woman in gold stilettos. An enormous Anselm Kiefer canvas hung opposite Guadagnino. Conversation turned to film and to Paul Thomas Anderson's Phantom Thread. That had been the age of Chanel and Dior, someone complained, and yet fashion was almost incidental to the movie. Guadagnino protested. It is a film about the essence of love, he said. She poisons him, and he lets her poison him.
I mean, I will agree with Guadagnino on that one, that Phantom Thread is not about fashion. So, Jesus Christ.
Talk moved on to opera, but then somebody began attacking Bernardo Bertolucci, and Guadagnino rose again in defense, looking flushed and sheepish. Bertolucci made major American studio works without abandoning his own aesthetic. Extraordinary, he said. In 2013, he and Fasano made Bertolucci on Bertolucci, a documentary in tribute. As servants began clearing the table for dessert, Dago presented Guadagnino with a gift in honor of his recent successes, a souvenir bottle of liqueur shaped like a penis and testicles.
I'm sure Guadagnino was like, oh yeah, I'm definitely gonna keep this, and then on his way out immediately threw it into the nearest trash can.
Guadagnino stood to make a little speech of gratitude. And that's all I got from this story.
Goddamn, Jesus Christ. So
Guadagnino is part of that group of Italian elites.
Yeah, that's...
he's embedded in that.
Man, well, good for him. That's some really, really dank content that he surrounds himself with. So, yeah, good for him, I guess. Next week, we are going to be talking about Overlord, which comes out in a few days.
Yeah.
So we'll see if it does actually relate to the Cloverfield franchise at all. It appears to be just about Nazi zombies, so we'll see. The trailers make it look pretty fun.
I'm
actually pretty excited for it. At the same time, memories of the Cloverfield paradox are not far from my mind, so I don't want to get too excited because the Cloverfield paradox also looked good in trailers, but we'll see. I'm always down to watch some Nazis get killed, so I'm excited for this movie in that respect. So check back next week for our thoughts on Overlord. If you like the show, leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod. Let us know what you thought about the new Suspiria and what you think of the original Suspiria. Tell us which one of us is right. Validate one of us and destroy the other.
Yeah, destroy our spirits.
Break us, please.
Tell us both we're awful and we suck.
yeah, tell
And
us.
we have small penises.
Tell us that both movies are okay and neither of them are very good nor very bad. That would honestly be the most contentious thing to say, I think. Follow us on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/podpeoplepod. You can see the list of all the films we've talked about on the show, our average ratings, and links to those episodes. Follow me on Twitter at Mr. Van Awesome.
And I'm at Mr. Sheets.
And thank you, as always, for listening. Check back with us next week for our episode on Overlord. And until next time, dance your fucking heart out, bitches. Witches.
Yeah, play us out with that slapper.